Hey Optimancers, Chris here. Today I want to finish up my series on DMing. And today we're going to talk about building encounters as a DM. So when you build an encounter, you want to do a lot more than just pick monsters for parties to fight, because that does get boring very quickly. The most interesting encounters tend to have other features built into them, and you as a DM can build those features in. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over some of the things I look to put into an encounter. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to build an encounter for an actual campaign that I'm actually going to run. Just to kind of show you the thought process I go through and the process I go through when I build an encounter. But before we do that, I want to thank some of the patrons for this channel. These patrons help keep this channel going, and I want to thank them so much. Today I want to thank Airhead, Alistair, Awesome Face, Bloody Nine, Christian Wyndham, Comfy Baphomet, Dash Panther, and Dave Peters. Thank you all so much for your support. So let's get started. So you have a campaign and you want to build an encounter. What are some of the things you want to do? Well, the first thing I want to do when I'm building an encounter is think about whether this is going to be a random encounter or a set encounter. And a random encounter is something I'm going to roll dice for, as characters are traveling around the setting as things they might randomly encounter. Well, a set encounter, of course, is something that is a set location. Usually with a set encounter, I tend to be looking at more than one encounter at the same time. And so that's the first thing you need to think about, because if you're going to have more than one encounter, then it's very likely that your PCs will be dealing with multiple encounters between one long rest. If you have a couple encounters in a day, it's actually not that much different than having one encounter. But once you start to do 3, 4, 5, or more encounters in a day, then players are going to feel like their character doesn't have enough resources to deal with all these encounters. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That really depends on the kind of feeling you're trying to create. Having several encounters can create a feeling of panic. It can create a feeling of fear. And sometimes that's exactly what we're looking for. And when it comes to random encounters, it really also depends on the setting as well. How many random encounters are players likely to face in one day? Are they going to be facing random encounters in the same day that they're facing set encounters? The more encounters players face in one day, the more you need to consider the difficulty of those encounters, because each additional encounter you add, especially after the second one, increases the difficulty because players will have those less resources to deal with them. But when I'm looking at an individual encounter, there's a few things that I think about as things I might want to include in the encounter. And this is not a list that I need to check off completely for every encounter. And I think that's really important. Not every encounter needs to have all these features. But there's still things to think about when you make an encounter, because that will help you make the encounter a little more interesting. And the first one, and this shouldn't be a surprise if you watched my first two videos, is tying it to the theme or the setting. So when you think about an encounter, the very first thing you want to think about is what are players going to encounter. And this shouldn't be completely random. Players wandering through the Underdark, players wandering through an enchanted forest, players wandering through the desert should be facing, of course, very different creatures. Also the kind of encounters that we might expect in a high fantasy campaign or a gritty realistic campaign might also be different. So think of your setting, think of your theme, and what kinds of creatures would we expect the player characters to be coming across, and pick from that pool. Second thing I like to think about is there a way that I can tie this encounter to a player's backstory? Now this is definitely one of those checklist things that I'm not going to be looking at for every encounter, but I don't want to ignore it for every encounter either. If we want to involve players' backstories into our campaign, tying them into encounters is a great way to do that. Does a player character recognize one of the enemies? Does one of the enemies recognize one of the player characters? Does the encounter relate to an event that occurred within one of the player's backstories? These are all things you can think about when you're creating an encounter, and they can often inspire you to make encounters as well. If you don't know what to do for an encounter, read your player characters' backstories, and those can often inspire you for an encounter that is also going to be interesting specifically for that player. The third thing I think about is how I might tie the encounter to the campaign. Again, not every encounter needs to be tied to the campaign, but some of the encounters should, even random encounters. Surely, if you have some big enemy, they have minions moving around the world. Or perhaps they have rivals, and we can work these into our encounters, and it builds the greater story of the campaign. Or maybe one of the encounters relates to one of the subplots that's occurring within the campaign. This can also be a hook. We can use encounters as a hook to pull characters into a direction of a subplot that they haven't yet discovered. We have a subplot dealing with a pirate king that the players need to go to their location and deal with. Well, maybe the random encounter then is a pirate attack, and that will give the players the hook to start investigating that pirate king. The fourth thing I consider is the map. Now, I tend to play on a grid, but even if you don't play on a grid, you need to consider what the terrain looks like that the encounter is going to occur on. It is really boring when every encounter is just on flat, open terrain. Having things to duck behind, having difficult terrain, having elevation changes, these kinds of things can really add to the interest in an encounter, especially when they're different from encounter to encounter, because it keeps the tactics constantly changing for the players. The fifth thing I like to consider is the encounter level or the challenge rating. Now, challenge rating is notorious in Dungeons & Dragons for being inaccurate, and it is. And this isn't always a problem with the way the game is designed. Some of these things are subjective, and some of these things can be different from party to party. Some parties are really effective at dealing with certain kinds of creatures and not very effective at dealing with other kinds of creatures. So we can have two creatures of the same challenge rating have incredibly different difficulties for two different parties. And then you take a different creature, and that could all be reversed. Does this creature just have armor class and hit points and do damage? Or does it have spell-like effects? Or does it have special attacks that provide saving throws? Does it do elemental damage? Or does it do bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing damage? All these things can vary the difficulty of an encounter from group to group. And once again, this comes down to knowing your player characters. If you've taken an interest in your player characters, you've also taken an interest in the design of those player characters. You know what kind of damage player characters do, or what kind of special attacks they can do, what kind of spells they can bring into a combat. We also need to look at our past experiences. What happened in the last session and the session before. We can get an idea of what a group can handle. We also get an idea of what kind of encounters player characters are really adept at dealing with, and those that they have more difficulty with. So does that mean we should throw challenge rating out the window? I don't think so. I think challenge rating is still really useful. It just is that we need to use challenge rating as a starting point rather than as an ending point. When you pick the kinds of creatures you might put into an encounter, go ahead and do your calculations for the difficulty of that encounter with the standards in the Dungeon Master's Guide. And this is the starting point. Now what you need to do is analyze, what can these monsters do? What can the player characters do? Have player characters had encounters like this before? If so, how did they handle them? Were they too easy? Were they too hard? Are there special abilities these monsters have that are going to be particularly effective against the party? Or do they have a lack of those abilities, so they're going to be ineffective against the party? Are there tactics these monsters can use to make them more challenging to the party? The challenge rating of an encounter should never be the end point. It is just the beginning. And speaking of thinking about the tactics of the creatures, the next thing you should think about is the setup of the enemies. If an encounter is going to be particularly tough for player characters, there are things you can do just with the setup of the encounter to make it easier for them. Giving player characters the chance to surprise an enemy, for example, gives a huge advantage in combat. Encounters you thought would be absolutely deadly can be dead easy once you give those player characters a full round in order to deal with the enemies. Well, in reverse, if you're ever going to give enemies surprise on the player characters, you need to think about that very carefully, because this can turn an encounter that you thought was going to be easy and turn it absolutely deadly. Especially think about it carefully if you have spellcasters with the enemy. Spellcasters plus surprise is particularly effective. This could absolutely wreck a party before they get their first action in combat. Also consider the positioning of the enemies. Are they going to be attacking the characters from the front? Are they going to be surrounding the characters? A group of enemies that surround the players are more difficult than ones that are attacking from one direction. And it's okay to put in things that are extremely challenging, and it's okay to put in things that are super easy. You have to tie the enemy setup to the overall challenge rating of the encounter and the overall difficulty of the encounter based on the analysis you've done. This really comes from knowing your player characters and using your intuition. Definitely draw from the experiences you've had in this campaign, because I run multiple campaigns and I can tell you that different parties will have different ability to deal with different challenges. And so this analysis is overly complex for me to just spell out in a video. But what I can tell you is, if you are in doubt, start easy. An encounter that is a cakewalk for players might not be a memorable encounter, but at least it is not a campaign-destroying encounter. It is way better to have an encounter too easy than too difficult. The next thing I need to think about is that, number one, not all encounters need to be combat encounters, and number two, even if they are combat encounters, there may be aspects of that encounter that are not combat related. An encounter might be just an opportunity for role-playing. The players come across an NPC and get a chance to interact. Encounter details that are not combat related might also deal with a clue that leads characters towards completing a subplot or the campaign itself. Or there might be details of an encounter that create a feeling or an emotion. Are the characters going to come across something really creepy? Things that are creepy are not always deadly. But just because there's an encounter detail that's not combat related doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to be a combat encounter. You can tie these two things together and get the best of both worlds. Let's design an encounter, and I'll show you the process I use. This encounter happens to tick the boxes that I presented earlier. Not every encounter needs to tick all those boxes. Now, at the time of filming this video, that encounter is not complete, so I don't know how it ended up, but I will write in the video description as to what happened in that encounter if you are interested. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about actually creating an encounter. So I'm going to create an encounter for an existing campaign that I'm running right now. And that campaign happens to be a Curse of Strahd campaign. And what I like to do is I like to have random encounters prepared beforehand. So I want to create a random encounter, and I want to talk about how I use some of the techniques that I talked about earlier in the video. So with this particular encounter, what I want to do is I want to tie it to somebody's backstory. Now with this particular encounter, it's probably going to come up randomly, but the encounter itself will not be random. I'm going to be setting it beforehand, and as I do my random checks, as the players are wandering around Barovia, occasionally, of course, I will roll an encounter. And the idea is, instead of just rolling on the table, I'm going to have an encounter pre-prepared. Now I want to think a little bit about the party itself, and with this particular party, what we have are players that have extremely high armor classes and can inflict an extremely large amount of damage. So these player characters are currently level 5, but they might be level 6 when they take on this encounter. Now I can tell you that with this party, a challenge rating appropriate encounter is like a nothing encounter for this group. There's a distinct possibility they'll take no damage and use no resources to win that fight. And this is very likely going to be something that occurs during traveling. And when they are doing encounters during traveling, there is also a high probability that this will be their only encounter for the entire day. So if I want this encounter to be interesting, and I think it's probable it will involve a fight, then I need to up the challenge rating. The only time I need to scale that back is if I'm noticing that the monsters have ways to bypass armor class. If monsters have spells that provide saving throws, for example, especially if they're not Constitution saving throws, because surprise, surprise, in a group of optimizers, the majority of the party has focused on their Constitution saving throws, and therefore their Wisdom saving throws and their Dexterity saving throws aren't quite as high. So if we have creatures that use abilities that require saving throws, then the encounters tend to be more challenging for the players. But in this case, with the encounter I've decided on, the characters are going to be able to take full advantage of their high armor class without having to worry about saving throws. So it's necessary for me to up the challenge. And just thinking about ways to bypass armor class isn't always fun for players because they built their character to have a good armor class. So sometimes it's fun to just be able to enjoy the fact that the monsters are having trouble hitting you. And so as a DM, if I'm going to have that kind of encounter, what I need to do to make it still challenging for the players is to make it more deadly than it would normally be for a group of adventurers of their level. Now here's the player character in which I want to focus on their backstory today. So this player character is named Skarn Stoneblessed, and he is an Aasimar and who appears as an orc, who is a divine soul sorcerer warlock. And in his backstory he talks about how he was born stone-blessed, and he has all these celestial markings over him, and the idea is that his character has been blessed by the stone. And he's flavored his arcane blast to be like these stony fists that fly at the enemies. He's flavored his spiritual weapon, so it's a rocky fist. And that's kind of the way he plays it, is that the character is tied to the stone and his spells are tied to stone as well. And so what I've done is I've worked in a way that his backstory fits in with the story itself. And so far in the campaign, there hasn't been a chance to introduce it. I've been dealing with backstories of other characters. It's time to deal a little bit with Skarn. So the player for Skarn is going to begin to understand after this encounter that his backstory is somehow tied into the campaign. And I don't want to get into details right now because the players of this campaign are probably going to watch this video. But as far as this encounter goes, it should have already occurred by the time this video comes out, so the players of this campaign are free to watch it. And so what I have decided on is I've decided on who Skarn's patron is and where Skarn gets his ancestral powers for sorcerer. And I can fit in a number of elements here. I can fit in a tie to somebody's backstory. I can fit in a tie to the campaign in general. And I can fit in the hard decision, which I talked about in my last video about making decisions that aren't always the easy or black and white decisions for the players. So what we're going to do is we're going to have the party confronted by some earth elementals. And those earth elementals have been in Barovia and they have been corrupted. But they don't know they have been corrupted. And what they believe is that there is a way for them to defeat Strahd. And the way, of course, that they can defeat Strahd is Strahd has a weakness. Strahd requires humanoids that he can feed off of. And they figure if there weren't any humanoids in Barovia, Strahd would starve. So to begin with, these earth elementals are going to be talking with Skarn in a very friendly way. They're obvious allies. But as the conversation unfolds, we want Skarn to start to figure out what their plan is. And then he has to make a decision. Is he going to continue to help the humanoids of Barovia? Or is he going to side with his ancestry and work with these earth elementals? Now I expect that they will likely attack these earth elementals because they're not going to want to kill the humans and humanoids of Barovia. And that's okay. It's okay for there to be one decision that is probably the right decision. But this should at least give the player who plays Skarn some doubt, some concern that he's going against potentially his patron. He's going against his ancestry. He's going against the things that he reveres that have given him these gifts. And that is going to be not an easy thing for him to do. And that's what we want, because it's going to create an emotional reaction. So this is likely going to be a fight. So how do we make a fight with some earth elementals interesting for this party, especially when this party delivers so much damage and has such a high armor class? Well, the first thing is we want an interesting map. So I'm working on Roll20 here, but this could work for your home campaign as well. This could work for a different virtual tabletop as well. But the first thing we want is our setting. So what should the setting be? Well, it should be something that's earthy and rocky. And I found a nice map that was shared on Reddit for free by SpliceX42. So thanks to SpliceX42 for providing your work to players for free. And I've gone with a pretty standard grid here. You could make it bigger, you could make it smaller, but I find too big can be cumbersome, and too small doesn't give the players enough room to move their characters around. So we're going to go for the standard size and see how it looks. So we've got our map on there, so I'm going to switch it to the map layer. Then what we're going to do is we're going to stretch it out. So if I look at it stretched out, so what we've got here is like a rocky ravine. This is, I think, perfect for earth elementals because it is going to be the right setting for them, and it's going to provide them some interesting tactical possibilities because earth elementals have earth glide. So these elementals will be able to sink into the ground. They'll be able to also sink into the walls of the ravine. So I figure we'll have our players come in from the top right corner, and they'll be moving down to the bottom left corner as they're traveling. And I figure the primary earth elemental is going to be a Galeb-Dur, just because I think it creates a little more interest, a little more versatility than just having earth elementals. If we look at the Galeb-Dur, it's a challenge rating 6 creature. Now it's going to have immediately the disadvantage that it doesn't have earth glide like earth elementals do. But the Galeb-Dur looks exactly like a regular boulder when it's motionless. So this is going to give it a chance to give kind of that surprise appearance to the party. Something I'm going to want to describe, that they are alert for danger, they're walking carefully in this rocky ravine, and suddenly one of the boulders is going to start moving. Now in combat, the Galeb-Dur has what is a rolling charge, so if it charges at a player, it does more damage. But basically we're looking at a +8 to hit for about 12 points of damage. If it can do the rolling charge, it'll be closer to 19 points of damage and potentially knock a player prone. And the Galeb-Dur can animate boulders, so it can create essentially a copy of itself that can do pretty much the same things that it can do, except the disadvantage is that it has to concentrate on that. So if the players figure that out, they might be able to try to interrupt the concentration of the initial Galeb-Dur. And I think we'll combine it with some earth elementals. And I think we can create an interesting challenge here because of the tactics that an earth elemental can use. Because earth glide does not prevent them from ending their turn within the earth, it means they can come out from the earth, punch, and then go back into the earth. This means that players are going to have to think about how they might want to use readied actions to defeat these kinds of creatures. And it's going to make them more challenging than just a bunch of hit points with fists. So what I've decided on is 1 Galeb-Dur and 4 earth elementals. According to challenge ratings, 4 earth elementals and 1 Galeb-Dur is a deadly encounter for this particular party. But I know the way this party works, and this party is really good at armor class, they're really good at doing damage, and they're particularly well optimized against creatures that just hit for damage and have a bunch of hit points. So by my estimation, this encounter should not cause any player character deaths, but hopefully will be difficult enough that they're going to have to expend some resources, they're going to lose some hit points, there's going to be some challenge. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our Galeb-Dur on the map and we're going to find a boulder, and there's one right there, and then we're going to put it on the GM layer. And what this is going to do is it's going to make it so that it is not visible to the players when this map is first loaded up, but then that boulder is going to start moving and it is going to address Skarn's Stone Blessed. Now we know this Galeb-Dur has that ability to animate stones, and it can do that to any stone within 60 feet of it. And I'm thinking the interesting way to do that is to have it occur right here, right beside the party. So I'm going to put it on the GM layer, and then it's prepared for when I want to reveal it. And this gives a little bit of a tactical challenge to the party, because of course they tend to have their melee characters up front and their more squishy characters in behind, and now we're going to have this creature appear from beside or behind the party. And then we want to add our earth elementals, and I found this artwork I kind of like, so I want to have that be the image that I show them as the earth elementals crawl literally out of the ground. So if you're on Roll20, the easy way to do that is just put the image on the map and throw it on the GM layer, and when you want to show it to the party, you just click on it and then you do a Shift Z, and that just pulls up the image for everyone to see. What I think I'll do is I'll put them on the sides, and that way it's a little easier for token management. And again, they're going to pop out, start attacking the party, and then pop back into the stone. So on the character's turn, they won't be available to attack. Now I imagine what the party will do is they're probably going to focus on the Galeb-Dur, or both Galeb-Durs, until they're destroyed, and then they're going to have to deal with these earth elementals. And the way they're going to have to do that is through ready to actions. So as I said, these elementals, I want to have them corrupted. So in order to defeat the bad guy here, they've kind of fallen into darkness. So what I've done here is I've added some bodies to the map, and the idea is that there will have been former victims of these elementals. And because of that corruption, what's going to happen is these humanoids are going to reform as shadows to join into the fight. Now, shadows are no problem at all for this party, but we're going to throw them in there more as theme than challenge. Now, because the players would see these bodies, but the characters wouldn't see these bodies when this encounter first begins, I'm going to begin by putting them on the GM layer so that they can't be seen, and then they can discover them later. So after the players have completed this encounter, and they're going to be able to discover these bodies, and they're going to understand that these shadows were somehow controlled by the earth elementals, and they're going to know something is wrong. Something is wrong with these elementals, something is wrong with whoever they're serving. And they're going to know that there's some kind of tie to Skarn Stoneblessed, and that is just going to give a hint as to how that backstory is going to be involved in the campaign. Last thing to do is to find some background music to play during this, and I figure I'll need 2 pieces of music, something ambient for the actual discussion, and something epic, again, maybe with some kind of stony vibe to it. I might look at see what I can find in terms of dwarven combat music. That often has that kind of feel to it. And this is now a complete encounter. So what did we do? Well, number 1, we've tied it to our theme. We're going to give it a bit of a creepy vibe. There's these earth elementals that Skarn should be allied with, but there's something wrong with them. It's been tied to a backstory. It is going to be tied to the campaign. We've picked a map that's appropriate. We've picked creatures that are appropriate. We've thought about the challenge rating and how that is going to apply to the party. We've thought carefully about how the enemies are set up. We've given some details to the encounter that are not combat related. We've thought a little bit about the tactics of the monsters. So all in all, this encounter doesn't take all that long to set up, but it should be something, hopefully, memorable to the party, specifically to the player for Skarn. Make him wonder about how his backstory is involved in this campaign. And that completes my 3-part series on DMing. Until next week, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks, everyone, and I'll talk to you next week.